Section 1 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Faye Huntington and Pansy. Dr. Deane's Way by Faye Huntington. Chapter 1. A Little Fire. "I think, Lois, you'd better not." "Why can't I should like to know?" "Your father wouldn't like it." "He never likes anything." "Lois!" "Well, it's so. I can't do this and I can't have that. I can't go there and I can't stir here at home because father won't like it. I'm just sick of hearing that same old story." Lois Deane sat by the stove, swinging her hood by one string while she thumped her heels impatiently against the legs of her chair. Mrs. Deane was stirring graham gems in the pantry. As she sifted the coarse, grayish meal through her fingers, she expostulated, "But, my child, your father certainly knows what is right and proper for you, and as a physician he is the best judge of what is healthful, and of course he has a right to regulate your expenses." "Health and economy! I've heard those two words until I fairly hate them." And the rapid thumps of the heavy winter boots gave decided emphasis to Lois's words. "I'd gladly be sick and extravagant for the sake of once being and doing like other folks. One thing is settled. I shan't have my lessons tomorrow if I have to sit in this room all the evening with father and Professor McDown. And I don't care a snap. I'd just like to know what is the use of having a stove in my room if there is never a fire put in it. I don't think it is a very ornamental piece of furniture. I'll sell it and buy something to eat besides graham gems." Mrs. Deane whisked the batter spoon about, passed it carefully around the sides of the yellow earthenware dish, and began to pour out her dough, but made no reply, partly because she was used to Lois's outbursts, and partly because she sympathized with her. "Hi, what's up now, Miss Pout?" The speaker was Tom Deane, who now appeared in the doorway, laden with school books and skates. "I guess you'll be Master Pout when I tell you," replied Lois shortly. "Old McDown is coming to talk politics and such stuff to-night, and we are so terribly poor that we can't have another fire, so you and I will have to study in the sitting room and not dare to breathe for fear they will be disturbed. That's what's up. And another thing, for fear you'll be a dyspeptic, you've got to eat bran all the days of your life. Nice, isn't it?" "Lois!" interposed her mother, as she deposited the despised bran cakes in the oven. "You are getting unwarrantably excited and bitter. You will probably be sorry some day for what you're saying." "No, I won't. It is every word true. I don't like the way we live, and I may as well say so. Tom, do come in or go out and shut that door. We can't afford to warm 2 rooms, much less all outdoors." Tom whistled good-humoredly as he hung his skates in the closet and put away his books before attending to his evening chores. There were no idlers allowed in the Deane family, and Lois had her own work to do, so she started up as Tom went out, and took her wraps to the closet. Tom had some way made a mistake and appropriated her hook for his skates. Now, one of Lois's greatest trials was that she was not allowed to skate. Dr. Deane did not think it proper for girls to skate, and the sight of Tom's new pair made her angry. Had it been any other article out of place, she would doubtless have removed it, and so ended the matter, but she went to the door and called, "Tom, Tom, come in right away." Tom was busy feeding and petting Black Jenny, but supposing it to be an important matter, he obeyed the summons at once. "What's wanted? Anybody killed?" "Take your old skates off my hook. I want to hang up my rubbers," was the ungracious command. "Well now, I'll give up. My lady has lost the use of her hands. How long since you were taken? Mother, got any what you call it, liniment cure-all or something? Better have them attended to before they get bad." And the thoroughly good-natured boy whistled himself away. "Lois Deane, I think that was a real mean thing to do. I wouldn't have done it." It was Kitty Deane who uttered this exclamation. Like her brother and sister, she had just come in from school, as usual, a little behind them. "Of course you wouldn't. But then you are perfect and I am not. That's the difference between us." "But, child," said Mrs. Deane, "it was not kind." "I know it. But the sight of Tom's skates makes me feel ugly. Just as if girls didn't want to have a good time as well as boys. There is going to be a skating party Saturday afternoon, and tea at Libby Kimball's, but as usual I have to be left out." For answer, Mrs. Deane only sighed as she placed the chairs at the supper table. She had long ago given up pretending to have a way of her own. A quiet, meek-faced little woman, she was spending herself for her family, sometimes sorely puzzled as to the ways and means of gratifying her children without crossing the prejudices of her husband. As a young girl she had indulged in dreams and aspirations which had died out in the cold, unsympathetic atmosphere in which she lived, and she thought of them sadly as she looked into the faces of her young daughters, and wondered if all the sweetness and innocence, the longings and cravings for a different sort of a life, would be quite crushed out. There were great possibilities in Lois Deane's character. But oh, how much she needed wise and loving guidance. Had Mrs. Deane possessed a stronger character, she might have gained her children's confidence, and, working for the mental and moral needs as earnestly as she did for their physical, kept them from follies that brought wretchedness in their train. The town in which the Deane family lived was not large. Indeed, it was so small that you might know your next door neighbor sufficiently well to lend her your last magazine, or send her a dish of strawberries from your garden, and borrow her napkins and china when you gave a tea party. The Deanes lived in a plain, comfortable-looking house on a quiet and thoroughly respectable street. Dr. Deane had taken care to put 3 blocks between his house and the public school, lest his quiet should be disturbed by the shouts of happy children who had not yet learned the art of repression. He hated noise, as his own children early learned, and his homecoming was the signal for putting away noisy plays. There was a sort of a subdued air about the people who lived on Elm Avenue. Boisterous shout and song were seldom heard. The children rolled their hoops and trundled their carts quietly until they reached the corner of Elm and Main streets, where a new atmosphere seemed to await them, and they were quickly transformed into the noisy, rollicking, and sometimes rude beings that are the especial torment of nervous people. If everybody had been trained according to Dr. Deane's idea, a very different sort of people would have inhabited this world. Very little variety of taste and habit would have been allowed, but everything and everybody would have been gotten up in a correct and proper style, moving on in straight lines, no jarring or chafing, not even a thumping of elbows. Things being very different from his views, he thought the world all wrong, and he meant that the little part which he had the control of should be set going right. But he found that the material he had to work upon was none too pliable. Theirs was a very plain, matter-of-fact way of living. Work to earn your bread, eat your bread to sustain life. Live — for what? Ah, I think that was where Dr. Deane failed. If he could have taught his children the secret of true living. As it was, he succeeded in making life somewhat hard for them. Truth was, the doctor was a dyspeptic. Nothing agreed with him, either physically or mentally, except the very plainest of food, both for body and mind. He had dyspeptic patients whose views of life were equally somber. And not content with prescribing for these and himself a rigidly plain diet, he insisted that the active, vigorous natures, The eager, expanding minds of his children should be sustained, grow, and develop upon the same food. He forgot that people cannot and will not all follow in the same groove, and that, unless there is a chance for them to diverge naturally and easily, there is danger that they may break over in perilous ways and places. Professor McDowne was an old college friend, and when he came to take charge of the academy, Dr. Deane seemed to throw aside his cloak of reserve and warmed into something quite like geniality toward the professor. It may be that in spirit he was carried back to the days of early manhood, before he had met with the reverses of fortune and suffered from the falsity of others, things which had helped to sour his temper and darken his life. Tea being over, I mistake, the beverage was not used in the Deane family. The evening repast being over, the center table was wheeled a little nearer the fire, and Dr. Deane and his guest sat down with the chessboard spread out between them. Chess playing was the doctor's sole pastime, but, mind you, he did not call it pastime. He played for the sake of the intellectual discipline it afforded. On this particular evening the game seemed to lose its interest, and the two fell to talking over old times. Tom and Lois were eager listeners. The large lamp on the table did not light up their corner very well. Tom couldn't find the cities and rivers on the map in the dimness, and Lois didn't care whether she had lessons or not. So both fell to listening. Ah, better had it been to let those old-time follies remain buried. Had Dr. Deane once looked toward that corner, he would have seen two pair of eyes filled with wonder and excitement. Could their father, grave and taciturn even to sternness, as they had always known him, and stately Professor McDowne have been the heroes of those exploits, wild and fantastic as they were? "Do you remember," said the professor, "how we confiscated old Jack's pears? And I don't believe there were ever pies like those you handed through Widow Stone's pantry window. But the greatest game of all was when I passed you off as my sister. I tell you, Professor, you've lost your girlish looks." And the two old chums laughed heartily at the recalling of their pranks. Even Mrs. Deane smiled, pleased to see her husband in such unusual spirits. Tom and Lois went to bed that night with ideas in their heads that they did not get between the covers of their school books. Months later, Lois exclaimed in her anger, "If you hadn't been so stingy as not to let me have a fire when I wanted it, I should never have got into such a scrape." As Tom shivered his way into bed, he said to himself, "Whew, father wasn't always such a sober stick. He didn't think it was such an awful thing to miss a recitation or go off on a lark. I'll take my share of fun after this." Ah, if Dr. Deane had only been in his boy's confidence, that he might have said, "Tom, my boy, your father was a wild youth. He sowed his wild oats, and they brought a harvest of shame and sorrow." As for Kitty, she curled herself up in a corner of the sofa and was fast asleep long before the interest in the game of chess began to flag. Kitty Deane was very unlike Lois in many things. For one matter, she was not afraid of her father. She was never disobedient, for she did what she liked, went where she pleased, took what she wanted without so much as asking permission. If her father chanced to reprimand her, sometimes she pouted, sometimes she laughed, and always said, "I don't care." When the doctor was displeased, he called her Catherine, which vexed her. When a very little girl, she would stamp her foot and exclaim, "Don't call me that." She didn't mind cold rooms, but as for graham bread, she flatly refused it. Once, when she was 9 years old, her father said, "Catherine, you must eat brown bread or go without your supper," and she went without. The next morning her father passed the bread. One look into his face told her that he was in earnest. She took a slice and swallowed it. Then she said, pleasantly, "Father, I ate that to please you." "Did you?" he said, surprised. "Yes, sir, and now won't you please not to ask me to eat another piece? Anyway, not for a great, great long time." For some reason best known to himself, Dr. Deane thought best not to press the matter, and thereafter Kitty ate her baked potato or her porridge and drank her cup of milk contentedly. Lois once passionately declared that Kitty was the favorite, which was her mistake. Kitty was not her father's favorite. Her ways did not please him. But upon the one or two occasions when he had undertaken to manage her, it had proved such a wearisome job that he gave it up and left the task almost entirely to Mrs. Deane, only throwing in a stern rebuke now and then by way of doing his duty. Truth to tell, Dr. Deane did not understand child nature. He had outlived his own childhood, what little there was of it. He had no sweet and tender memories of a loved and loving childhood. There was stern discipline in the early home, and prompt obedience born more of fear than love. But as much could not be said of his own children. They grew up saucy and rebellious. At least this was true of the daughters. Tom was different, and Dr. Deane could not understand it. If Mrs. Deane understood it, she could not help it. She thought her husband too strict, and without knowing it she encouraged their waywardness. Though the 10 Commandments were early drilled into their memories, they had never been taught to honor father and mother in their lives. They never considered that because he was their father he had a right, God-given, to their respectful obedience in those things not contrary to God's requirements. End of chapter 1. Section 2 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Faye Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dr. Deane's Way, Chapter 2. How Great a Matter it Kindleth. Jenny Matson was a boarder at the seminary boarding house, and she was Lois Deane's particular friend. Among schoolgirls, that phrase means that they shared each other's secrets under the strictest promises never to tell, shared each other's nuts and candies and all other schoolgirl treasures, met with loud expressions of delight after the separation of a night, and when school hours were over, parted with lingering step and many farewells. They never missed any opportunity of being together, and ignored for the most part the existence of their schoolmates. However, there were 4 or 5 other couples which, standing in the same relation to each other, formed with these a sort of clique. Now, a set of schoolgirls made up in this way are capable of the most wonderful achievements. By their cunningness and keenness, their ingenuity and audacity, their sauciness and their sweetness and simplicity, they carry their points. By some of these means they manage their superiors, and really nobody seems to know that they are being wheedled and coaxed into some absurdity. Lois and her friends were assembled in Jenny's room during the long recess discussing plans, a committee of ways and means. "I'll tell you," said Lois, "what to do. Let's have a masquerade party. Some night I'll stay here with Jenny, and we'll get together after the 9 o'clock bell and fix up in all sorts of costumes." "Splendid!" said the others, all in a breath. Such scheming and contriving as followed. "What will we do about refreshments?" asked Jenny. Several plans were suggested, such as asking cook to give them supplies, using their pocket money to buy the necessary articles, but these modes were altogether too correct and proper for their purpose, and just here the teachings of that fatal evening again developed themselves, and Lois came forward with her plan. "You know," she said, "the day scholars bring lunches. We'll help ourselves out of their baskets." "And perhaps we can get into the storeroom downstairs," said Jenny. "There's the sliding door. We can climb through that if we can't find the key." So the plotting went on. It required several days to perfect their arrangements, but finally the party came off, and was pronounced a grand success by the participants, and of course they knew. It brought out all of Lois's strategic powers to gain the necessary permission to stay all night with Jenny, and once the plan seemed near failing entirely for want of so simple a thing as this. But finally, upon her showing that she and Jenny were learning a duet that required much practice together, and which they were to sing at the coming examination, the desired object was gained, but only because Tom was laid up with a lame foot, and could not go for her at 9 o'clock, as Dr. Deane had at first insisted. The brilliant idea of pilfering the lunch baskets had been successfully carried out, and little Minnie Frink had squeezed herself through the slide, and handed out a whole pie and a lot of pickles with cold meats. Julia Wright's room, being the largest, had been selected as the scene of the play. Those who were busy with their toilets when the under-teacher went her 9 o'clock round had simply responded to her tap, "Light out at once," and no mischief was suspected. 5 minutes later a strange group was assembled in Julia's room. The costumes had been kept a secret. Remember, their secrets were in couples. And here were two in boys' dress. Who could they be? Of the 10 girls engaged in this frolic, Lois Deane was one of the last to be suspected of such an impropriety, but when the masks were removed, the exclamations were, "Lois Deane! Jewel Wright! How could you? That's what you had your hair cut for, was it? Before I'd have done that for the sake of a little fun." "Little fun!" said Julia. "I mean to have considerable out of it before I'm done." "How did you get your dress?" "I found a way." And Julia never told. There are ways found for many things that parents and teachers never dream of. Oh, mothers and teachers, seek the confidence of the young girls, save them from the follies that, in a greater or less degree, bring shame and remorse. Said a lady, not long ago, "I am filled with surprise when I look back to my school days, that I was not utterly ruined in health and mind, body and soul, and I was a steady girl compared with many of my companions." The masquerade was over, and they were not found out. Just as the clock struck 12, one by one they glided stealthily through the dark, lonely halls to their rooms. The room was cleared up, all traces of the feast put away, nothing left about that could tell the story of the night's frolic. After all, the eating had been the principal part of the entertainment, and if there is truth in the old saying about stolen fruit, they must have had a deliciously sweet repast, for everything was stolen. Of course the girls did not employ that ugly word. Lois remembered that her father and Professor McDowne had used the newspaper word confiscation, and she introduced it for their use. The girls who were in the habit of leaving their baskets in the cloakroom had missed their lunches, and the cook knew that the storeroom had been invaded. But the suspicions of all parties pointed to the boys' hall. The girls chuckled over this, and congratulated themselves upon their expertness. "Isn't it jolly?" said Lois, as she talked it over with Jenny. "I'm glad everybody don't believe in Graham. I don't know what father would say to my eating such things." "He would feel worse about that than about your stealing it, wouldn't he?" laughed Jenny. Lois flushed. "It isn't stealing, not real stealing. It is only for fun, you know. There can't really be any harm in it, for it is precisely what Professor McDowne told about doing, and laughed over it as a good joke." "And I suppose that when we are 40 years old, we may tell of it and laugh over it, but we don't exactly want to be found out now, do we?" "I reckon not," replied Lois, horrified. "It would be hotter for us than the pickled pepper you fished out of the jar and took in your mouth when you thought you were going to drop it on the stairs." "My, wasn't it hot, though!" This was only the beginning of a series of mad frolics. It seemed as if the very spirit of mischief had entered into these girls. A tide of insubordination swept through the school, and none could tell where it rose. Certainly the Deane and Matson clique were, to all appearance, most exemplary in conduct. But their sport came to a sudden stop. Someone had said, "Lois, your own father would never recognize you in that costume." And straightway Lois was possessed with a wild desire to try the masquerading outside Julia Wright's room. With wits sharpened by practice, they made their opportunities, and one bright evening Jenny Matson found herself walking out with her cousin from Buffalo. But Dr. Deane's eyes were keener than Lois's schoolmates had predicted, and his anger more intense than they could have imagined. Lois was marched home, Jenny was reported to Professor McDowne. Pretty soon the whole story came out. Lois, Jenny, and one or two more of the leaders were excused from farther attendance upon the sessions of the school, and order was once more restored, much to the relief of the puzzled faculty. After the first outburst, when Dr. Deane poured out his wrath upon the head of his offending daughter, he rarely spoke to her for weeks. He gave orders that she should not leave the house unless accompanied by himself or her mother. But this could not last. The unaccustomed confinement soon affected Lois's health, and the practiced eye of the doctor saw this, and he was sorely puzzled. He felt obliged to allow her more liberty, though he did not trust her. Meantime, the fruits of that careless talk were cropping out in another quarter, but fortunately only to be nipped in the bud. Some time before the humiliating ending of the girls' fun, Tom Deane sat perched upon a desk in one of the recitation rooms, surrounded by half a dozen boys, to whom he was recounting the stories of the professor and the doctor. "Now, boys, say we go in for some sport." "Say we do," said Will Arnold. "There's no use in going on in this poky fashion." And then and there a plan was laid for a wild adventure, a plan which was never to be carried into execution. The fire in Professor Morse's room was a failure that morning. It smoked and smoldered, and finally went out altogether. The professor shivered and growled, and threatened to complain of the janitor. Then, gathering up his books and his papers, he rolled his armchair into the hall, stationing himself beside the register close by the recitation room. Thus it was that the talk of the boys floating out through the open transom came to his ears. What should he do? He was very busy, and the quickest way to end the matter and spoil their sport would be to report to Professor McDowne. There were reasons why he disliked to do this, and he decided upon another course. Laying aside his work, he tapped lightly at the door and entered. He was a favorite teacher, and the faces brightened at his entrance. He swung the door wide open and brought his chair into view, and, smiling, said, "Well, boys, I have been driven to the hall by the coldness. If one of you will go out there, you will find out how distinctly every word of our conversation can be heard." The boys looked crestfallen, and Professor Morse continued, "You've been listening to some interesting stories. Suppose I tell you some to match them?" The boys were reassured and looked up brightly. "Yes, do," said Will Arnold. "Well, I don't suppose you will like mine quite as well, but they are true. When I was preparing for college, we Academy boys were as ready for frolic and adventure as any of you. No matter who suffered in person or property, so long as we had our fun and were not found out. Sometimes we stole fruit. Sometimes we rang doorbells at midnight. Once we carried away every gate on Main Street and hid them in the woods. But that was a sorry night's work, for, having been watched, we were compelled to carry them back by daylight. Another time we borrowed Mr. Grimes's new cutter to ride downhill, and ran against a stump, and in consequence our fathers had the privilege of paying $20 apiece to keep us out of jail. I can tell you, boys, such kind of sport don't pay. I cannot think now where we put our manliness at such times, for we all aspired to the name and position of young men. Some of those very boys entered college a year or two in advance of me, and were there to bid me welcome, and it was a welcome that I never forgot." Professor Morse walked with a crutch, and as he spoke he glanced at his shrunken limb. He continued sadly: "It was a bit of sport that had become an established usage, and had never resulted disastrously before, but I was made a lifelong sufferer by it. I can't tell you that story. But, boys, I wish you wouldn't carry out your plans." "We won't," said Will Arnold promptly. "I'll have nothing to do with it." "Nor I," said one and another. "Thank you. Such things are not manly, not worthy of one who aspires to the title of gentleman, and certainly they are not Christian. I know they are common, and even supposed to be a necessary part of one's school and college life. But I cannot see why an act which ordinarily would subject a young fellow to a fine and imprisonment should be tolerated, and even commended, in schoolboys and collegians." End of section 2. Section 3 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Fay Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dr. Deane's Way, Chapter 3, Held Back. Dr. Deane was a Christian man. He was anxious that his children should become Christians, but he wanted them to come into the kingdom in his way, by the path he had marked out. Their Christian experience must be such as his own had been, or it was no true experience of Christ's love and forgiveness. He expected that the lambs of the flock would walk wisely and soberly and discreetly, even as those who had the wisdom of years to guide them, and the cares and sorrows of life to subdue them. He wanted to lift his children out of child world at once. Wise in many things, he was lamentably deficient in his knowledge of his own children's hearts, and he could help them very little in their seeking for Jesus. Dr. Arnold was pastor of the church to which the Deanes belonged. During the latter part of the winter he had united with the pastor of 2 other churches in holding extra meetings, hoping to advance thereby the cause of Christ. God was present with them by his Holy Spirit, and every evening some souls were won for Jesus. Dr. Deane looked on disapprovingly. He didn't believe that different denominations could work together harmoniously. He didn't mean to stand in the way of good being done, but he couldn't feel like taking hold of the work as he should if the meetings were conducted according to his mind. Why, several ladies had spoken in the prayer meeting! He could not countenance such a thing. Yet he hoped that his children would be awakened to a sense of their sin and danger. He thought Dr. Arnold was apt to encourage children to think they were Christians without a deep and thorough experience, and sometimes where there was no marked change in the life. He must guard against their making any mistake. As usual, Kitty came and went as suited herself. She attended the inquiry meetings. To her pastor she said, "I want to be a Christian. I think I love Jesus now. I think about him all the time. I try to think about my sins and to feel sorry, but I can't. Just as soon as I begin, I think right away how he promised to wash away my sins, and then I am so glad and love him so. Tell me what I must do." "My dear child, go right on loving him. He will show you your work soon, I think. Only try to keep near to him by prayer and study of his word. May God bless and keep you." There was a change in Kitty. Dr. Deane could not deny it. She was more respectful to her father and mother, more thoughtful of the comfort of others, and more patient under reproof. But no word passed between her and her parents as to the new life she had entered upon, until one afternoon she came in just after her father. "Where have you been, Kitty?" he asked.
"Down to the church."
"To the church?" he repeated in surprise. "What for?"
"Why, you know," she said, hesitatingly, "those who want to unite next Sunday were asked to meet the committee this afternoon."
"Did your mother know?"
"I didn't tell her."
"And you went without consulting any one. Kitty, I am surprised that you should take such a step upon your own responsibility. Why didn't you come to me first?"
"I thought you would be glad. You prayed this very morning that we might all belong to the invisible church as well as the church on earth, or something like that. I didn't like to speak about it. I thought Dr. Arnold had, though, or I shouldn't have gone. I'm sorry you don't like it."
"Kitty," said Dr. Deane, "I cannot consent to your taking such a step at present. I am very glad if you have really passed from death unto life, but you are young to join the church. You cannot understand the responsibilities involved."
"Father, I understand that Christ said, 'Do this.'"
"Yes, child. Still, I think you had better wait a while, until you are certain that you are not deceived in this matter. I am afraid that you do not understand the principles that underlie the Christian hope. Is the plan of salvation clear to you, Kitty?"
Kitty was silent. Finally she said, "Dr. Arnold didn't ask me any such questions. He only asked me why I wanted to come, and if I was willing to belong to Christ, and a few more things like that."
"Yes, I know. Dr. Arnold has some very singular ideas. I will see him myself and explain the matter. I think you must wait a few months at any rate."
And poor Kitty, who longed to follow Christ's command, looked down from the gallery upon the solemn scene when, with many others, 3 of her dear girl friends, belonging to her Sunday school class, were allowed to sit at the Lord's table. Her heart was very heavy, and the tears would not stay back as she bowed her head, saying simply, "Dear Saviour, I wanted to obey thee, but they held me back." And Jesus himself was her comforter, and Kitty went out from the feast at which she had been only a witness, with her soul strengthened, and with a quiet happiness that did not grow less as the days went by. But when another communion season came around, and still her father kept her back, she became almost discouraged. She had been so unfortunate as to incur his displeasure by being thoughtlessly gay, and he said, "Kitty, I cannot consent that you should take this step yet. I do not feel satisfied. We are enjoined to walk soberly, and you do not seem to realize what a solemn thing it is to be a Christian." "But, Father, I am so happy I can't help being lively. I don't feel sober nor solemn, and if I thought I must, I wouldn't want to be a Christian. I don't believe that Jesus wants me to feel that way either. I think it is a great deal more solemn not to belong to him than it is to know that he is our best friend."
"Kitty, you speak of Christ too familiarly. You should remember the infinite distance between the King of Kings and poor worms of the dust."
Now Kitty had learned to think of her Saviour as an elder brother, as an ever-present friend. As she had known him, there was not an infinite distance between her own soul and her Redeemer. But her father's words made her feel very sad. He had been a Christian a long time, of course he knew. He was a great deal wiser than herself, she very well knew. It must be as he said, that she was not steady and sober enough for a Christian. Oh dear, she would have to wait a great while. Meantime, Tom had been led quietly to accept Christ. In the early part of the revival he had spoken of his desire to follow Christ, and some weeks later he said, "I am glad I set out to seek the Saviour, and would say to my companions that if they will seek him he will be found, and will reveal himself a great joy and an ever willing help." Dr. Deane felt it his duty to interfere. He had not known that Tom was passing through any great struggle. He had not seen any signs of deep depression, of great sorrow for sin. He was too anxious, too fearful that Tom's experience was not thorough. So he questioned: "Tom, I was glad to hear your voice to-night. I did not know that you had passed through the crisis. When did it occur?" "What, sir?" "Why, when did you find peace in believing?" "Oh, I have been trusting in Christ for several weeks. I suppose that always brings peace," answered Tom. "Yes, but will you tell me the circumstances of your conversion?" "Why, father, there isn't much to tell. I got interested. Professor Morse talked with me about youth being the best time to begin to serve Christ, and I thought so too, and I began to pray and ask him to receive me and forgive me. And after a while, I don't know how long, I thought he had accepted me. Now I am asking him to show me what I ought to do for him." "But, Tom, can't you tell the time when you yielded to God, the time when your burden of sin fell off, and a new and sudden light broke in upon your soul?" "No, sir, I don't think there was anything sudden about it. I just began to pray and kept on, and slowly I seemed to get nearer to Jesus." "Tom," said Dr. Deane solemnly, "it is a fearful thing to be self-deceived. I think one ought to be able to tell exactly when and where the change takes place. When one gets peace without knowing how or where he got it, I am afraid it may prove a false peace." And this conversation and others like it got Tom to doubting. Why couldn't Dr. Deane let his children come to the Saviour as they seemed to be drawn? Why couldn't he have known that the Spirit does not operate upon all hearts alike? As for Lois, the one for whom both her parents felt most anxious, no persuasion seemed to affect her. She appeared hardened and reckless. Sometimes she went to church, and her father relaxed his guard over her to allow her to accompany some of her young friends upon one or two occasions, but he repented this when he discovered how recklessly improper was their conduct. Not content with standing aloof while others were flocking to the cross, Lois and her companions attracted attention, and called out a mild rebuke from the pulpit by their unseemly behavior in the house of God. The father was saddened by all this, but I am not sure that he was not more angry and mortified than sorrowful. Lois was certainly very trying, and seemed bent upon going the wrong road. What was to stop her? If she would only come to Christ, I think he would not have minded the manner of her coming, and perhaps if she had been gently and tenderly urged, she might have come. But when her father put it in this way, she would not. "Lois," he said, "I wish you would pay more attention to religion. This would be a good time to make your salvation sure. Under the circumstances, it would be well for you to come out a Christian. It would help you to regain your character." "No," said Lois to herself, wilfully misapprehending her father. "I am not going to put on a cloak to cover up my wickedness. I'm bad, and I'll show bad." Many were gathered into the church during that year, but Dr. Deane's children were not among them. Whose fault was it? Lois continued to attend the private school, but things did not go on smoothly at home. Greatly exaggerating the disgrace Lois had brought upon herself, and as he imagined upon the whole family, her father looked coldly upon her best efforts, and between discouragement and anger, Lois kept in a chronic state of unamiability. More than ever she needed tender, loving counsel. Her mother was loving, but, truth to tell, Lois could manage the mother a great deal better than the mother could manage Lois. Dr. Deane was puzzled. End of section 3.
Section 4 of Dr. Deane's Way and Other Stories by Fay Huntington and Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dr. Deane's Way, Chapter 4. The Beginning of Something New. All at once a thought came to Dr. Deane, which seemed to him like a sudden inspiration. So exactly did it accord with his mood that he determined to act upon it at once. He remembered the stern discipline of his boyhood's home, and recalled the relentless severity with which his boyish faults were punished, and said to himself, "I'll take Lois to my mother. She will know how to manage the girl. I'm thinking my lady will have to walk straight if she once gets under that roof." Lois was dismayed at the proposal, but dared not rebel openly, and Mrs. Deane knew that opposition was useless. So the two quietly and hastily made their preparations, and a week from the day the plan was broached, the father and daughter were on their way. "Never mind, Loie," said Tom, at the parting. "The ogress won't eat you up." "She'll find a peppery dose if she undertakes it," interrupted Lois, laughing through her sobs. "That's so," responded Tom. "But, see here, don't you go to sprinkling pepper or throwing snaps the first thing. If you are only a mind to do your best, you can get on the right side of grandma, and then you'll get on all right. Just you look sharp to that." "What chance to get on the right side will there be, I'd like to know, after father has told everything he can think of?" said Lois, bitterly. "Oh, father won't tell. He's too proud. You needn't worry about that." But Lois did worry all that long day's journey. She longed to ask her father how much he meant to reveal of the past to the new friends to whom she was going, but she did not dare. Very little was said on either side, though Dr. Deane was kinder in voice and manner than he had been for a long time, and the stern look on his face seemed to soften. I think that, as he journeyed toward the old home, a throng of memories pressed upon him and stirred his heart, until somewhere from its depths arose the tender emotions of his nature which he had so long ignored. The last 10 miles was a stage ride, and they were the only passengers. Lois shrank from being alone with her father, but he tucked the robe about her so carefully, and thoughtfully arranged a satchel for her feet, speaking so gently that the tears sprang to her eyes. Noticing her emotion, the doctor said, "Lois, I have not meant to be harsh, but your conduct has been a sore trial, and its consequences very mortifying. As for sending you away from home, I have done it for the best. You would not find it easy to break away from old associates and build up your character again at home, while at your grandmother's you will have a chance to start fresh. But, Lois, you must learn deference to your superiors and obedience to those in authority. My mother will not brook a disregard of these duties, nor will she put up with your hoydenish propensities." Dr. Deane had not seen his mother or the old place for nearly 20 years, and he had little idea of the changes that had been going on. True, through the medium of a regular though by no means frequent correspondence, he knew that one by one his brothers and sisters had gone out to make new homes, that his father had been dead several years, and that his mother had charge of the farm. And, too, various improvements about the house and grounds had been mentioned in the letters from home. But, after all, it was the homely, wood-colored house standing in the shadow of the great hill, toward which he seemed to be traveling. It was a home full of young life and busy, bustling activity. They were all there, the hard-working father, grave and somewhat stern like himself, the noisy boys and blooming girls, and his mother. Ah! Had Lois known of the picture in her father's mind, she might have wished yet more earnestly that the stage ride, unpleasant as it was, would never end. Old Mrs. Deane was emphatically a strong-minded woman, with a stateliness and reserve that seemed like coldness, and lack of love and sympathy, with an intolerance of youthful follies, and a power of restraining those under her authority from entering foolish ways, that, irksome as it had once been,
now seemed to the distressed doctor the very embodiment of virtue, and such was the memory of his home and his mother, that he was utterly bewildered when the stage stopped. There was the 2-story house, longer than he remembered it, and seemingly lower, and there was the hill, but they were not the same. The house had been extended at the side and in front. The color was a pale buff, with dark brown trimmings. There were piazzas and a bay window. The road had been built lower down, so that the lawn was wider. The wild berry bushes were gone from the hillside, and an air of refinement as well as of thrift pervaded the scene. Everything seemed to be of generous proportions, house, barns, lawns, garden, and orchard. All this Dr. Deane took in at a sweeping glance as the man unfastened Lois's trunk and took down the doctor's satchel. And did that calm, sweet face, shaded by the soft, merry border of her widow's cap, belong to his mother? The old roundness and freshness were gone, and with it much of the severity of expression. She sat in an armchair before the fire and welcomed her guests without rising. "My son," she said, clasping his hand and drawing him down until his lips met hers. Dr. Deane could not remember that his mother had ever kissed him before in all his life. Doubtless in his babyhood such a thing might have happened, but since he could remember any expression of affection had been rare indeed, and the grave, taciturn man was for a moment disconcerted and embarrassed. As he drew back to give place to Lois, the old lady said, "And this is my granddaughter, whose acquaintance I have so long desired to make. Ah, Thomas, you have kept your treasures well to yourself all these years. Never mind, we shall make it up now, won't we, dear?" Then turning to a young lady several years older than Lois, who had admitted them, she continued, "Thomas, this is my friend and companion, Miss Halsey. I have written to you of her." Probably she had, but her son had forgotten, if indeed he had ever taken in the idea of such a person's existence. After their introductions were ended, Mrs. Deane said, "Alice, you will please attend to Lois's wants now. Is her room warm? Perhaps she had better wait here until you call George to carry up her trunk. And as you go through the kitchen, tell Jane to give us something hot with our tea. I forgot to mention it when she came for orders, but there is time enough for muffins and cutlets." "Hot bread and meat for supper!" thought Lois, and she stole a look at her father to see what his face expressed upon the subject, but the room was growing dark, and she could not read the look. The travelers were soon shown to their rooms, and when they came down again they found tea upon the table. Poor hungry Lois must have thought this the opportunity for which she had once longed, to eat and be sick. There was fragrant tea, the whitest bread and the lightest muffins, a fried chicken, with jelly and pickles, with some late peaches smothered in sugar and cream. And Dr. Deane, what did he do? Why, just as the rest did, ate what was set before him, and he was much more likely to be kept awake by his thought than by his supper. Truth to tell, he could not believe his senses. As we have said, he had never realized the changes of the 20 years of his absence. Indeed, it had been 30 years since he had been at his old home for any length of time. He remembered his mother young and vigorous, in a dress of dark blue print and a check apron, taking her plain meals in the low kitchen. He saw the table now, with the brown homespun tablecloth, sometimes without any, and the blue-edged crockery, the tin teapot, the little japanned pepper-box, and blue glass salt. And the contrast was so great that the doctor was bewildered. Here at the head of this generous table, with its handsome appointments, sat a woman 70 years old, a specimen of beautiful old age. She had grown old, but the peaceful triumph written on her face told how. Everything about her was in keeping. The soft bombazine dress, with folds of lace at throat and wrists, the comfortable chair in which she sat, and in which she was wheeled to the table by Alice without rising, the bright, well-furnished room, and the cheery face of her companion, all spoke of plenty and of great happiness. When they were all seated at the table with bowed heads, Mrs. Deane's voice, low but clear, broke the silence. "I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together." The next morning Mrs. Deane said to her son, "I am sorry that you could not have the old south room. It would seem so much more homelike. But Mr. Hastings occupies that when he is here, and I did not like to have his books and papers disturbed." "Oh, no matter," replied the doctor. "My room is very pleasant. But who is Mr. Hastings?" "Well, to be sure, don't you know? He is our minister. You see, his folks live over at Greenville, and he preaches there half of the time, and when he comes to the valley to preach, he stops here. He has gone home now to stay over the Sabbath." "So you have a minister in your family," said the doctor, wondering, what next? While they were at breakfast, Mrs. Deane said to Alice, "I presume that Lois will want to unpack and put away her things this morning. See that the fire is lighted. It is very chilly. If this weather holds, we shall have to get the furnace going. But I wanted to have Bailey come over from Greenville to put those registers in your room and Lois's before we start it. Mr. Hastings is going to speak to him about it." Turning to her son, she asked, "Do you heat your house by a furnace?" Lois would have answered, "We don't heat it at all," but wisely allowed her father to speak for himself. Already Lois was delighted with the home to which her father had brought her. "Everything is so comfortable," she had whispered to herself as she came into the breakfast room and toyed with a kitten before the fire, while Jane was bringing in coffee and hot cakes. As for the doctor, he began to suspect that his daughter's banishment would turn out quite an agreeable thing. But he had committed himself for a 6 months' trial of it, and could not draw back. Besides, he still had faith in his mother's ability to manage the girl. As Tom had predicted, he had not revealed the whole story of Lois's misdoings, only in a general way given his mother to understand that the child was hard to manage, and that he thought a change of associates desirable. Before leaving, he was about to deliver some charges concerning Lois, but his mother interrupted him. "Now, Thomas, it won't do for you to say that Lois must do this and mustn't do that. Very likely she will and will not, as the case may be. But you have committed her to my care, and I want no restrictions. With God's blessing, I hope to return her to you sound in body and with a clean heart." So the doctor said his farewells to Lois with no word of admonition, and laid no commands upon her. Once during his visit he had expressed surprise at the remarkable change in his mother and her manner of living. Mrs. Deane replied, "You know that for many years before your father died we were wonderfully prospered. I do not know, but I have thought that the Lord saw that we could bear prosperity, and so gave us an abundant reward for our toil. Your father was a faithful steward and gave freely to the church at home and abroad. He fitted up the homestead. He said he wanted to make it a pleasant place for the children to come back to once in a while, and he left a provision in his will, as you know, that if any of them or their children should be in want of a home, its doors should be open. As for the change in me—" Here a voice tender in speaking of her husband grew solemn. "Thomas, it is of the grace of God. 15 years ago he gave me a blessing so rarely given because rarely sought. Call it what you will, I call it the gift of peace. It is promised, you know, to those whose minds are stayed on God. My mind is stayed on the Lord. I have my cares and some anxieties, and as you well know, we have had some heavy trials, but the Lord has always helped me over the rough places. When I became a confirmed invalid, he sent me my faithful Alice, who brought perpetual sunshine into the house, and it is she who has in some measure broken up my old still reserved habits."
"Well, mother," responded the doctor, "I am glad to find you so comfortable in your old age. But I tell you plainly that Lois needs a firm hand. I am afraid you will be too easy with her."
"Now, Thomas," said the old lady, "my ideas of the strict training of children have undergone no change, but having experienced so much of the love and tenderness of my heavenly Father, perhaps I have come to think of more gentle measures. Think of the patience and forbearance of the Lord towards us, and say if we ought not to bear more with the waywardness of our children."
"Maybe you are right. We shall see how you get on," was the reply of the doubting doctor, who went on his homeward way, thinking in this wise: "Mother overrates the power of love. I'd like to be around when the first tiff comes off. Lois can't keep out of mischief long, and her high temper is ready to go off at a touch. That Miss Halsey seems a pleasant person, a little too lively. If she wouldn't laugh so often, and make so many trifling remarks, she would appear much better."
If Miss Halsey had heard him, she would have said, "Thank you, Dr. Deane. I might appear better, but I should not appear myself, and I'd rather be myself than somebody better."
"It is a good thing," soliloquized the doctor, "having the minister there so much. His presence will likely prove a check upon Lois. I am sorry I could not have met him."
Then, meditatively,
Hastings. Why, there used to be a minister by that name in Milton. That was 25 or 30 years ago. He must be an old man, but I shouldn't wonder if it were the same one.
And the doctor settled himself complacently for his homeward journey, reflecting that, with such experienced advisers as his mother and old Mr. Hastings, Lois could not fail of improvement.
End of the story, Dr. Deane's Way.
End of section 4.